Billionaire family mocked a black woman at a party minutes later, she killed their $30 billion deal. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Who the hell are you supposed to be? The question wasn't shouted. It was laughed. It rippled across the ballroom wrapped in champagne bubbles and old money amusement, sharp enough to cut through the orchestra without ever raising its voice. The party was everything power liked to pretend it deserved. Crystal chandeliers burned overhead like frozen suns. Marble floors reflected gowns worth more than houses. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed too loudly, already certain the night belonged to them. At the center of the room stood a small cluster that drew every eye. A billionaire family, silver-haired patriarch grinning wide, his wife leaning forward with a manicured finger pointed midair, their daughter laughing openly, delighted by the attention. They looked comfortable. Entitled. At home. Across from them stood a black woman in a white evening dress. The dress wasn't loud. No sequins. No spectacle. Just precision. Clean lines. Confidence stitched into every seam. She stood straight, shoulders relaxed, her expression unreadable. Beside her was a black man in a midnight blue suit. Calm. Observant. Silent. Not a bodyguard. Not a guest trying to impress. Someone who belonged exactly where he was. The matriarch laughed again, louder this time. Honestly, she said, waving her hand dismissively, security has gotten so sloppy lately. Anyone can just wander in now. A few people chuckled. Others looked around, gauging whether it was safe to join in. It was. Phones began to rise. Black screens catching reflections of gold and cruelty. A moment like this was currency. And everyone wanted proof they'd been close enough to watch. The daughter leaned in, eyes sparkling. Did you come with the staff? She asked, smiling as if it were a joke. Or are you someone's +1 who got lost? The father laughed hardest. Does it matter? He said. She won't be here long. Still, the woman in white didn't react. No apology. No explanation. No anger. Her calm made the laughter stumble. Someone nearby whispered, why isn't she saying anything? The matriarch took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound intimate, just loud enough to be heard. People like you always misunderstand rooms like this, she said. Access doesn't mean acceptance. That's when the man beside the woman shifted slightly. Not forward. Not defensively. Just enough to remind the room he was there. Before anything could be said, the woman in white finally spoke. Soft. Even. Is this how you treat your guests? The question landed wrong. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't pleading. It carried something else, certainty. The daughter scoffed. Guests. She laughed, pointing now, openly. Oh please. Don't flatter yourself. The laughter returned, louder, freer. The room relaxed. Power, after all, loves an audience. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to her. The woman in white looked around the ballroom. At the chandeliers. At the cameras. At the faces that had decided, without knowing her name, that she didn't belong. Then she reached into her clutch. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable. but it quieted the space just enough. She pulled out her phone. The matriarch smirked. "Calling your ride?" she asked. "Good. Saves us the trouble." The woman didn't look at her. Her screen glowed once. A single message. 3 words. "Cancel the deal." Across the city, unseen by the laughter and silk and crystal, systems began to shift. Contracts paused. Notifications queued. $30 billion money that held up legacies, reputations, entire bloodlines started slipping out of reach. But in the ballroom, the family was still smiling. Still laughing. Still confident. They had no idea that the woman they were mocking wasn't a guest. She was the reason the party existed at all. And the deal they were celebrating? It was already dead. The room didn't know it yet, but the moment had already passed. Laughter still drifted beneath the chandeliers. Champagne glasses clinked. The billionaire family continued smiling, basking in the comfort of a world that had always bent in their favor. To them, the woman in white was already finished another small interruption in an otherwise perfect night. But for her, this was not an interruption. It was confirmation. She stood there quietly, phone returned to her clutch, posture unchanged. If anything, she looked lighter, as if a decision long delayed had finally been made. The kind of decision that doesn't need witnesses to be real. Her name was Elena Carter. And she had spent her entire life learning how rooms like this worked. She hadn't grown up with chandeliers or marble floors. Her childhood was fluorescent lights and borrowed desks, the low hum of offices she cleaned after hours with her mother. Places where power wasn't announced, it was implied. Places where you learned early who was allowed to speak, and who was expected to disappear. Elena learned something else there, too. That systems mattered more than voices. Years later, when she built her first company, she didn't chase attention. She chased structure. Contracts that protected people. Capital that moved quietly but decisively. By 45, she no longer needed to walk into rooms like this to be seen. Tonight was an exception. The gala wasn't just a party. It was a deadline. Across the room, the patriarch of the family raised his glass, still unaware. His empire, real estate, private equity, legacy assets passed down like heirlooms, had been bleeding for years. Bad bets. Worse timing. Debt hidden behind reputation. The deal they were celebrating tonight was their last real lifeline. $30 billion. Elena's money. But the family didn't know her face. They never had. Every negotiation had been handled through attorneys, intermediaries, layers designed to protect her privacy. To them, the investor was an idea. A signature. Not a person who could be mocked. Not a woman who could hear them laugh. The man beside Elena, Marcus, her co-and husband, watched the family closely. He didn't touch her arm. Didn't speak. He knew better. This wasn't a moment for comfort. It was a moment for alignment. Elena met his eyes briefly. A single nod. Across town, her legal team was already moving. The message she'd sent was enough. No explanations. No debates. Just execution. The merger wouldn't implode publicly, not yet. It would simply stop. Like oxygen cut off from a flame. Back in the ballroom, the daughter's laughter rang out again. "Relax," she said loudly. "She's probably never been to a party like this before." Elena didn't respond. She turned instead, calmly, and began walking toward the exit. A few heads followed her. Some curious. Some dismissive. None concerned. The matriarch scoffed. "Figures," she muttered. "They always leave." Yes, Elena thought. We do. But not empty-handed. As she passed beneath the chandeliers one last time, her reflection fractured across 100 mirrors, white dress stained only by shadow now, eyes steady, unhurried. By morning, headlines would scramble for words. By the end of the week, this family's name would mean something very different. The party behind her swelled again, unaware. And that ignorance, their last comfort, was already expiring. If power had a smell, it would have lived with them. Old leather. Polished wood. The faint metallic tang of money that had been inherited long enough to forget how it was made. The family called themselves stewards of legacy. Everyone else called them inevitable. The patriarch Richard Hale stood at the center of the ballroom like it had been built around him. 68 years old. Silver hair cut with military precision. A smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had inherited an empire of towers and trusts, and spent decades convincing people it was still solid. It wasn't. But reputations can float longer than balance sheets. His wife, Margaret, played her role flawlessly. She ran foundations, chaired boards, curated guest lists the way other people curated art. To be invited by her was to be validated. To be excluded was social exile. She didn't raise her voice often, she didn't need to. A glance, a comment, a whisper in the right ear did more damage than shouting ever could. And their daughter, Claire, was the most dangerous of all. 31. Educated at the right schools. Beautiful in the way magazines loved. She had grown up watching power humiliate people without consequence, and she had learned the lesson perfectly. Cruelty, when delivered with charm, was still applauded. Tonight, she was enjoying herself. They stood together now, glasses raised, basking in the unspoken understanding that this night was theirs. That it always had been. Around them, donors laughed, investors leaned in, politicians nodded. No one asked hard questions. No one ever did. What none of them could see was the weight pressing on the family's shoulders. Behind the smiles, the empire was cracking. Vacancy rates climbing. Debt stacked on debt. A private equity fund hemorrhaging capital after a disastrous overseas expansion. The numbers were ugly enough that Richard had stopped looking at them directly. Instead, he trusted the deal. The deal fixed everything. $30 billion didn't just rescue a company, it rewrote history. It turned mistakes into footnotes. It ensured the name Hale would remain untouchable for another generation. The merger was supposed to be announced tonight. Champagne now. Headlines tomorrow. But the investor remained invisible. No interviews. No photos. No appearances. Just a signature waiting at the end of a chain of documents that lawyers had been massaging for nearly a year. Richard had never met her. He'd never even asked what she looked like. That kind of money didn't need a face. Around him, the laughter swelled again. Claire leaned toward her mother. "Did you see her?" she said, amused. "The one in white." Margaret smiled thinly. "She won't be a problem." Richard chuckled. "They never are." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the problem wasn't standing in the room anymore. It was moving. Quietly. Across town, phones were lighting up. Not with alarms. Not with panic. With confirmations. With phrases like "per client directive" and "effective immediately." With pauses where there should have been progress. In the ballroom, a junior executive frowned at his screen, confused by a calendar alert that had suddenly vanished. A legal advisor excused herself to make a call. A donor felt a flicker of unease he couldn't name. But the Hales kept smiling. They always did. Power, after all, teaches you the wrong lesson that the world warns you before it takes something back. Tonight, there would be no warning. Only silence. And when it arrived, it would be too late to laugh. What the Hales never understood was this. Power doesn't always arrive with introductions. Sometimes it enters quietly, signs papers through intermediaries, listens more than it speaks, and waits. For nearly 11 months, Elena Carter had been a name buried in legal language. Not on invitations. Not on programs. Just ink at the bottom of drafts, revisions, and carefully negotiated clauses. The kind of presence that didn't need to be seen to be felt. To Richard Hale, she was an abstraction. A fund. A vehicle. A solution. Every call had gone through attorneys. Every discussion filtered through advisors trained to keep her invisible. He preferred it that way. Faces complicated things. Power, he believed, should be distant, impersonal. If he had known she would be in the room tonight, he might have behaved differently. But ignorance had always protected him. Across the ballroom, while champagne flowed and the orchestra tried to recover its rhythm, Elena's absence went unnoticed. That was the irony. The moment she left was the moment the night lost its anchor, but the party continued, weightless and unaware. Marcus stepped out beside her into the cold night air. The city hummed below them, indifferent to legacy and laughter. "It started," he said quietly. Elena nodded. She didn't ask for details. She trusted process more than reassurance. The deal hadn't exploded. Not yet. That would come later, when it hurt the most. For now, it was being dismantled piece by piece, clauses invoked, contingencies activated, approvals withheld. All legal. All clean. All irreversible. Back inside, Margaret Hale was greeting donors, her smile polished and practiced. She didn't notice the subtle shifts: how a banker excused himself early, how a senior partner avoided eye contact, how a junior associate whispered into a phone with a furrowed brow. Claire laughed at a joke that fell flat. For the first time that night, the room didn't quite laugh back. Richard checked his watch. The announcement should have happened by now. He signaled to his chief advisor across the room, a small impatient gesture. The advisor frowned. Shrugged. That was new. Somewhere deep in the building, a server refreshed. A calendar cleared. A signature line went blank. Elena stood beneath a streetlight, white dress now silvered by the city glow. She looked back once at the towering windows of the ballroom, where silhouettes still moved behind glass. "They think tonight is about celebration," Marcus said. "It is," Elena replied calmly. "Just not for them." She thought of all the meetings where she'd been underestimated. All the rooms she'd entered quietly. All the times she'd been mistaken for staff, for support, for anything other than the person in control. Tonight wasn't revenge. It was alignment. Inside, Richard Hale felt it at last: not panic, not fear, but a thin crack in certainty. A sense that something had shifted without permission. He didn't yet know what. But power, when it withdraws, never does so loudly. It simply leaves a vacuum. And vacuums collapse everything around them. The collapse didn't arrive like a crash. It arrived like silence. Inside the Hale family's private conference suite just 2 floors above the ballroom, Richard Hale stood staring at his phone, the glow reflecting off his cufflinks. The screen showed no alerts. No red warnings. No screaming headlines. Just one line. Pending confirmation delayed. He frowned. Tapped refresh. Again. Nothing. Downstairs, the party continued, but the sound no longer reached him. Music bled through the walls like an afterthought. Laughter felt distant. Unimportant. He turned to his chief advisor, a man who had spent 20 years smoothing over crises before they reached the surface. "What does that mean?" Richard asked, keeping his voice level. The advisor hesitated a fraction too long. "It means the final approval hasn't cleared yet." "That was scheduled for tonight." "Yes." Richard didn't like the word "yet." He never had. Across the city, Elena Carter sat in the back of a black car, the engine humming steadily beneath her. The city lights slid past the windows, indifferent and bright. Her phone rested face down in her lap. She didn't need to look at it. Marcus did. Legal confirmation just came through, he said quietly. Withdrawal acknowledged. No breach exposure. Elena exhaled slowly, not in relief, but completion. Good, she said. Proceed with phase 2. Back at the gala, Margaret Hale felt the shift before she understood it. She'd lived long enough among power to sense when it stopped answering her. Conversations shortened. Eyes wandered. A senator she'd expected to corner later suddenly made excuses to leave early. Claire noticed it too, though she didn't know why. Her laughter sounded louder than necessary now, forced. She checked her phone, irritated to find messages unanswered. "Dad," she called softly into the hallway. No response. Upstairs, Richard Hale's phone finally rang. He answered on the first vibration. Yes. A pause. His expression tightened, not dramatically, but enough. The advisor watched closely as color drained from Richard's face in stages, like a tide pulling back. "I don't understand," Richard said slowly. "We were assured." Another pause. His jaw clenched. "So you're saying, the investor has exercised discretionary exit?" Silence again. When the call ended, the room felt smaller. The advisor spoke carefully. "Who was it?" he asked. "Who pulled out?" Richard didn't answer right away. He stared at the dark screen, as if it might explain itself. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't even know her name." Downstairs, the orchestra missed a beat. A glass shattered somewhere near the bar. The party stumbled, just slightly enough to be felt. Elena's car turned onto the highway. Behind her, $30 billion was no longer theoretical. It wasn't a promise or a hope or a lifeline. It was gone. And for the first time that night, the Hales were no longer laughing. They were listening. To the sound of something enormous slipping out of reach. The truth didn't announce itself. It leaked. Back in the ballroom, the first sign wasn't panic, it was confusion. A quiet, spreading kind. The kind that made people check their phones twice. That made conversations trail off mid-sentence. A hedge fund manager frowned at his screen. Refreshed. Frowned again. A lobbyist slipped away toward the exits, already typing. A senior banker leaned close to a colleague and whispered something sharp enough to drain the color from her face. Margaret Hale noticed the shift and hated herself for noticing it so late. She smiled anyway. She always smiled. "Let's keep the energy up," she said to no one in particular, lifting her glass higher than necessary. "Tonight is about celebration. But celebration needs certainty." And certainty was evaporating. Claire stood near the bar, scrolling furiously. 3 messages sent. None returned. Her reflection in the mirror looked different now, too bright, too exposed. For the first time that night, she felt watched. "Where's Dad?" she muttered. Across the room, a junior associate finally lost his composure. I think something's wrong," he said to his supervisor, voice barely controlled. The merger announcement folder just disappeared from the shared drive. "That's impossible," the supervisor snapped. "Refresh it." "I did. 3 times. The orchestra slowed, sensing the room's unease. Notes stretched too long. Applause came late. Then Richard Hale reappeared at the top of the staircase. The room quieted without realizing why. He descended slowly, every step measured, his face composed but altered, like a man who had just read something he couldn't unread. Margaret met him halfway, her smile already faltering. "What happened?" she whispered. Richard didn't answer her. He looked past her, scanning the crowd as if searching for something or someone. "Where is she?" he asked quietly. Margaret blinked. "Who?" "The woman in white." A ripple passed through the nearest guests. Heads turned. Whispers ignited. She left, someone said. Richard closed his eyes for half a second. That was enough. Phones began to buzz in earnest now. Not politely. Not discreetly. Vibrations stacked on vibrations. Screens lit up like warning flares. A donor gasped softly. They pulled out. What? The investor. The whole thing cancelled. No, that's not. It's confirmed. The word traveled faster than truth ever did. Cancelled. $30 billion didn't vanish quietly anymore. It left footprints. It shook foundations. It made powerful people suddenly aware of how thin the floor beneath them really was. Claire stared at her phone, frozen. Dad, she whispered. What does this mean? Richard finally spoke, his voice low and flat. It means, he said, choosing each word carefully, that tonight is over. Around them, the room fractured. Conversations collapsed into arguments. Laughter curdled into accusation. People began calculating exits: social, financial, moral. No one was looking at the chandeliers anymore. No one was filming. Margaret's voice shook for the first time in decades. Who did this to us? Richard didn't answer. Because somewhere deep down, he already knew. Power hadn't been taken from them by force. It had simply stood up, walked out, and closed the door. And they had laughed as it left. They found her near the entrance. Not rushing. Not hiding. Elena Carter stood beneath the soft wash of the lobby lights, white dress immaculate now, hands relaxed at her sides as if nothing unusual had happened upstairs. The city's night pressed against the glass behind her, vast, indifferent, honest. Richard Hale approached first. Up close, the certainty that had carried him through decades looked thinner. Not broken. Just, exposed. He studied her face the way men like him studied balance sheets, searching for leverage, for something familiar to grab onto. You, he said finally. Elena met his eyes. Yes. Margaret arrived a breath later, breathless in a way she never allowed herself to be. There's been some kind of misunderstanding, she began, voice warm, practiced. If something offended you earlier, we can. Elena raised a hand. Not sharply. Not rudely. Just enough. I'm not offended, she said calmly. That unsettled them more than anger would have. Claire stood a few steps back, arms crossed, face flushed. You humiliated us, she snapped, the words tumbling out now that control was gone. Do you have any idea what you've done? Elena turned to her then. Her voice didn't rise. Do you? She asked. Silence settled between them. Richard tried again, lowering his tone, switching strategies. We can fix this, he said. Deals like this don't just disappear. We can talk. We can make this right. Elena considered him for a moment, not as an enemy, not as a victim, but as a man who had confused access with authority. You could have made it right earlier, she said. All you had to do was nothing. Margaret frowned. Nothing. Nothing, Elena repeated. No comments. No laughter. No assumptions. She glanced back toward the ballroom, where the music had finally stopped. You didn't need to know my name, she continued. You didn't need to know my net worth. You didn't need to know why I was there. Her eyes returned to Richard. You just needed to treat me like a human being. The words landed without drama. Without threat. And they were devastating. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time that night, he had nothing rehearsed. Elena turned away. Marcus was already holding the door. As they stepped into the night, the glass doors slid shut behind them with a quiet finality. Inside, the Hales stood, frozen legacy intact in name only, their power suddenly theoretical. Outside, Elena breathed in the cool air. Dignity, she knew, didn't demand apologies. It moved on. And let consequences do the talking. The fallout didn't wait for morning. It never does. By the time Elena's car merged into traffic, the first calls had already gone unanswered. Law firms refreshed inboxes. Banks froze mid-process. Quiet assurances turned into carefully worded denials. Inside the Hale family's world, doors that had always opened without effort suddenly stayed shut. By midnight, Richard Hale's phone had become useless, ringing without relief, vibrating with questions no one wanted to answer. Longtime partners spoke in cautious tones. Old allies requested time to assess exposure. The word temporary appeared often. It meant permanent. Margaret sat at the edge of their penthouse sofa, gala heels kicked off, foundation chairwoman by title only now. Her charity board chat went silent. Invitations she once controlled stopped arriving. Social capital, she realized too late, had always been rented. Claire watched her social feed collapse in real time. Comments vanished. Likes stalled. Someone had clipped the gala footage, her laughter, her pointing finger, and posted it without context. The context came anyway. By dawn, financial media picked up the thread. Not the insult. Not the party. The absence. Major investor withdraws from Hale merger, $30 billion deal scrapped hours before announcement. Markets don't care about legacy. They care about momentum. Hale stock dipped before breakfast. Then it slid. Across the city, Elena slept. She woke late, sunlight cutting across the hotel room floor. Marcus was already on his laptop, eyes calm, movements efficient. Phase 3 is live, he said. Secondary partners are stepping back. Regulators requested documentation. Elena nodded, sipping coffee. And the staff, she asked. Protected, Marcus replied. No layoffs. No collateral damage. That mattered. Back at Hale headquarters, emergency meetings bled into each other. The words audit and liquidity circled the room like predators. For the first time, employees looked at leadership with something other than admiration. They looked afraid. By afternoon, the family's name was trending, but not the way it used to. Commentators debated arrogance, entitlement, miscalculation. Someone asked aloud how a firm that powerful could lose everything overnight. The answer was simple. They had mistaken silence for insignificance. That night, as the city settled into a different kind of quiet, Elena stood by the window of her suite and watched lights blink across the skyline. Somewhere behind those lights, consequences were still unfolding, methodical, impersonal, complete. She didn't celebrate. She never had. Justice, she believed, didn't need applause. It only needed time. The city moved on. Traffic returned to its rhythms. Markets absorbed the shock and recalibrated. Headlines cycled forward, as they always did, hungry for the next spectacle. But beneath the noise, something quieter took shape, something lasting. For the Hale family, silence became the loudest sound in the room. Meetings were postponed. Invitations rescinded. Calls rerouted to voicemail. The offices still stood, glass and steel unchanged, but the air inside them had thinned. Decisions that once took minutes now stalled. Authority, stripped of certainty, began to look like suggestion. Richard Hale sat alone in his study that evening, jacket folded over a chair he no longer bothered to wear. He stared at framed photographs, groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, smiling faces caught mid-applause. Images of power performing itself. For the first time, he understood what had been missing from them. No humility. No restraint. No memory of consequence. Margaret stopped hosting. Without audiences, there was no stage. She filled her days with tasks that felt busy but went nowhere, replaying the night in fragments she wished she could edit. A laugh. A gesture. A moment that cost more than money. Claire disappeared from the feeds that once celebrated her. Without attention, her confidence withered. She learned, slowly and painfully, that cruelty needs a crowd and crowds move on. Across the city, Elena Carter returned to her routines. Morning meetings. Quiet dinners. Work that protected people who would never know her name. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't correct narratives. She understood something the Hales never had: power doesn't need to be explained to exist. Weeks later, she passed the ballroom again, lights dimmed now, doors closed for renovation. The building looked the same. The meaning did not. Marcus glanced over. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked. Elena considered the question. "No," she said. "I think about what comes after." They walked on. Because dignity, once claimed, doesn't linger where it isn't welcomed. It advances. Quietly. Deliberately. Leaving behind a lesson that needs no narration. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits. And when it leaves, it takes everything that mistook disrespect for safety.